Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. And welcome to the Bowen Award presentations and the Bowen Award lectures. My name is Michael Manga. I'm currently serving as the Volcanology, Geochemistry, and Petrology President, and I will be chairing the first of these two talks. Dominique Weis, President-elect for VGP, will chair the second Bowen lecture. It is such a great honor to introduce the Bowen Lecture. The Bowen Lecture is delivered by the recipient of the Bowen Award. This is the highest award conferred by the VGP section. This year, the pool of nominations was so exceptional that the Bowen Award Committee selected two people, Mary Reid and Graham Pearson. So we get the added pleasure of having two Bowen Award lectures. The Norman L. Bowen Award and Lecture are presented annually to one or more mid-career or senior career scientists in recognition of outstanding contributions to the fields of volcanology, geochemistry, and petrology. Awardees are selected for the honor based on a single outstanding contribution published in any journal, a series of papers, or any other contributions the Bowen Awards Committee deems worthy. The first Bowen Award lecture will be given by Mary Reid from Northern Arizona University. Her citationist is Jonathan Miller from San Jose State University. But first, oh, right, go ahead.
Okay. Excuse me. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Mary Reid as the recipient of one of the Bowen Awards this year. And Mary is receiving the Bowen Award for her creative and innovative application of Zircon geochronology for understanding active silicic magma systems. Her 1997 paper in Earth and Planetary Science Letters, Prolonged Residence Time for the Youngest Rhyolites Associated with Long Valley Caldera, Ion Microprobe Dating of Young Zircons, launched a new area of inquiry into magmatic processes, presenting both the analytical and intellectual framework for conducting and interpreting the geochronology of young zircon by SIMS. Unique and groundbreaking insights of this paper have shifted our understanding of the rates and processes involved in magma storage, recharge, and eruption. Mary employed U-series disequilibrium dating to show that zircons contained within the products of a single eruption have ages that span tens to hundreds of thousands of years, implying a complex and protracted pre-eruption history of subvolcanic magmatic evolution. Were the zircons recording the residence time of melt-rich and potentially eruptible magma, which was her preferred interpretation at that time, or were zircons being recycled largely through solidified parts of a much broader magma reservoir? These questions, in turn, spurred efforts by the modeling community to explore the conditions required to maintain, maintain melt-rich silicic magma over these timescales, and parallel efforts to understand the processes and timescales of silicic melt segregation from crystal mush. Mary's work subsequent to the 1997 paper, both on her own and with her students on Long Valley, Yellowstone, and the youngest Toba Tuff, represent collectively a tour de force of insights into the operation of large, hazardous silicic magma systems. These papers, along with the many papers by other researchers using her techniques, have revealed subvolcanic magma systems to be dynamic, long-lived, and complex environments. Mary Reid's work on silicic magma systems has had an enduring impact on the VGP field. She is deserving of the Bowen Award in every respect. Mary.
So we're going to do this awkward thing where we present. Where's Dominique?
well, my first task here is to read my response, which is a heartfelt thanks to AGU for the Bowen Award, one that carries a name known to every student of geology. I'm truly honored and humbled. Thanks in particular to you, Jonathan Miller, for nominating me, and to Olivier Bachman and Calvin Miller, who could not be here, and to Tom Sisson, who is here, for writing thoughtful, at least apparently, letters of support. The four of you and innumerable other scientific colleagues and friends have made adventures in the world of geochemistry and petrology lively, provocative, and gratifying. So I've been continually intrigued by the generation and storage of magmas and by developing new approaches for our understanding of them. It's been gratifying, therefore, to watch myriad new insights unfold as our scientific community unlock the clocks stored within individual crystals. I'm indebted to Jim Gill, who first introduced me to U-series disequilibrium dating, and to Tim Grove, Stan Hard, and Nobu Shimazu, who encouraged me to pursue research independently and inspired me with their diverse approaches to dissecting complex geologic problems. The UCLA gang of Mark Harrison, Kevin McKeegan, and ion microprobe whiz Chris Koth created the intellectual and technical environment that made it possible for me to tease tiny time signals from micron-scale domains within minerals. Working with and nurturing the careers of many talented graduate students has been the proverbial gift that keeps on giving, especially as they try to keep me honest about magmatic processes. In the context of this honor, I particularly want to acknowledge Jorge Vasquez, Carrie Cooper, Justin Simon, and Wendy Borson. Finally, my life would not be complete without my family, Jim Sample, Caitlin Sample, Jane Reid, Jana Blickertoff, and Francis Albarade. You are my trusted supporters, critics, and companions, always encouraging me to look beyond the horizon. Thank you. All right, I guess now is when I get to sing for my award. By speaking on the reflections on the generation, storage, and mobilization of intermediate to silicic magmas. So let me start by just saying that, you ask somebody to draw the plumbing system for a stratovolcano, and they might draw something like this, not a non-expert. A balloon of, vast magma connected to the surface by a straw and connected to somewhere deep down below by another straw. In fact, when we take maybe what is a more, and I got to get used to finding out where my pointer is, okay. When we look at maybe at what is kind of what a petrochronologist might consider more realistic picture these days, much more complicated, but surprisingly, we still sort of have a balloon and a straw here, but for those of you who work on stratovolcano systems, this is much more complicated. And more massively, when we look at things that ultimately lead to caldera-forming eruptions, and especially those responsible for super eruptions, we see this vast complex of magmatic processes and magmatic effects that are essentially transforming the crust. Let me see if I can do this with the mouse, but anyway. So I'm not going to specifically focus on super eruptions, but because many of the areas that I have focused on are responsible for super eruptions, I thought I would say a little bit about them. These occur globally about once every 100,000 years, and they tend to be associated with long periods of time or repose between eruptions. A familiar example is Yellowstone, where there are 3 calderas, and they've been responsible for 3 large eruptions. 2 of them would be considered super eruptions, the first and the last. Now, you might imagine, given a 100,000-year frequency in these large volumes, that we ought to be able to go out and look for magma that's building up to this cataclysmic, voluminous eruption. And yet, when we look for them, under, say, for example, Yellowstone, and this is a little bit dated, I apologize to those who are experts on Yellowstone, you might have a different preferred cartoon. We don't find evidence for a lot of magma being stored beneath the surface. Even though, again, if we're building up to another cataclysmic large eruption, you might expect to see something like that. Under Toba, it's had the eruption 74,000 years ago, and so we might again expect, because it's been responsible for 3 caldera-forming eruptions, there should be more magma accumulating beneath the surface, and yet it's difficult to tease out whether there really is magma there or not, or this is just the residual effects of the heating that occurred in the magma that's cooling down and freezing from the previous eruption. So to think about this, as again, many of you are already who are experts in this field can attest, we've really started to think about these systems as being more dominated by crystal-rich regions, with the magma system being fed by a mantle-derived melts, and then magma being stored in both lower crustal and upper crustal domains, where there's largely large domains of partially solidified melt, areas that have more than 40% crystals, either distributed as, oops, got ahead of myself, either distributed as, let me take you back a sec here, either distributed as, mush, so with melt present, or more solidified domains that have a minor amount of liquid present. And then we have these domains of melt-rich magmas, both in the lower crust and the upper crust, that are potentially the materials that might erupt. So as my cartoon suggests, we have areas of potentially melt-rich regions, but they're largely crystal-dominated, and so they're locked up, and regions that are more and more mobile. We try to think about that, how a real system might behave over time. We can imagine, if this is temperature and time, and our liquidus temperature and our solidus temperature, that in a given system might undergo these excursions between being relatively hot, cooling off, and then being recharged and remobilized by new melts, cooling down again, and so on and so forth, with this sort of, cycling between these different kinds of conditions. And in a simple scenario, you might imagine each time it gets recharged, we get a volcanic eruption, and so on and so forth. In fact, what might also occur is that we have many of these episodes occurring and it doesn't lead to eruption. And so the system can cycle again between relatively more mobile conditions, relatively less mobile conditions, cycling between larger volumes of melt, larger volumes of crystal material. All right, so what that means is, and especially in the context of the work I want to present, is that the crystals that are crystallizing over this time might record and integrate a dynamic magmatic history. So I wanted to focus largely on the three caldera complexes that I have, loved, the iconic supervolcanoes, the Yellowstone caldera complex, Toba caldera complex, and the Long Valley caldera. And these are areas where I've done a lot of my work, as have my students, and it's been a pleasure to work in these environments. What I can't do, because I wanted to focus on the basis for this award and things outcomes that have come from it, is to bring in other examples, but I can't bring in everything. That turns out that 50 minutes or 45 minutes is pretty short, actually. So I wanted to give a shout out to those of you who've been my colleagues as this work was developing, especially during the time that's being recognized by this award. So this is where it all began. The UCLA Ion Microprobe, I was fortunate to be part of the team with Mark Harrison and Kevin McKeegan to bring the large radius ion microprobe to UCLA. And we like to say, it's the first one of its kind in the Western Hemisphere. We're very proud of that. It turned out that Mark and Peter Holden happened to be looking at some zircon and, spectra, and they noticed that there was a peak at 230 thorium, or a mass of 230, and speculated maybe that's 230 thorium, but maybe it's just a bunch of garbage, which is not uncommon. And when you do a spectra with an ion microprobe, it's just sputtering all kinds of material into the mass spectrometer. And so who knows, what was this, this all about? So I took it upon myself to see if I could determine that this really was 230 thorium, and to see if it's possible to actually do what we call in situ dating, but really is spatially constrained dating, so contextually constrained analyses. And because I was working in the Western Mode and Long Valley, I thought, well, this is a prime target that I could take on for the reasons that I'll show you. So here's the topographic caldera margin, and within the topographic caldera margin, this region we call the moat, are a couple of silicic domes. South Deadman Dome that erupted essentially yesterday, geologically, and Deer Mount, which erupted about 150,000 years ago. So this sort of cow pie looking thing is the young dome, and then this more respectable looking dome is Deer Mountain. And I thought, here's a chance to look at zero age. Do we see really essentially, virtually no 230 thorium as a result of the 238 uranium decay? And this is kind of in the sweet spot in terms of uranium-thorium dating for those of you who are familiar with it, and I thought it'd be a good place to check the results. Now, 230 thorium, as I showed down here, has a half-life of 75,000 years, so that's really the metric that we have to use in terms of determining what's an appropriate time scale. Something older than 300,000 years, we're going to have a hard time getting an age. What I expected, honestly, going into it was that I would find that the ages were essentially eruption ages, and this would be a new technique for getting at eruption ages. What I found instead was quite different, and so this is from the original paper showing the ages that I determined, and just for a comparison ratio between uranium and thorium, essentially. Now, it's important, and I didn't really want to get into the details of the analyses, but it involved really convincing ourselves that these dates really were real, that we were not just looking at mass interferences, and that we knew how to calibrate for uranium-thorium fractionation in the instrument. So all those details are in the paper, and I'm not going to talk about those. But what I found was a lot of dates that came out around 230,000 years, not just in the Deer Mountain eruption, but also in this younger South Dead Man's Dome eruption. Fortunately, the youngest ones in Deer Mountain, well, they kind of match eruption age, so that gave me some confidence that we really were seeing, appropriate ages. And although it's not zero age, we saw very young-looking zircon in the South Dead Man's Zone, as you might expect. There's been some late crystallization. And as well, a couple of other ones that seem to match, the ages that we were seeing for Deer Mountain. So it was as if these two systems were talking to each other, they were sharing some zircons, or events that were influencing them were responsible for zircon crystallization. And we were starting to see back into the time windows when the magma was being created and stored beneath the western moat of Long Valley. I presented this work at the Goldschmidt Conference in 1997. And what I really wanted to emphasize was the fact that now we could date individual crystals and we could date subdomains within them, but also that they gave us insights into the assembly of silicic rocks and their longevity and storage conditions. So this is back when Goldschmidt was just 400 people. I had the distinction of being the last talk at the meeting. I mention that to those of you who are just starting your careers, don't get discouraged. It might all work out in the end. Reactions to this work were also mixed. There were people, who said, depending on whether they mostly work on plutonic rocks or mostly worked on volcanic rocks, timescales are too short. There's no way that the magma is just there for a couple 100,000 years, or the timescales are too long. These are small eruptions. They can't be sitting around for this period of time. And honestly, that was kind of my reaction to it as well, and it's still been a little bit of a puzzlement. Some people were skeptical. People who worked on ion microprobes said, I don't know, can they really separate that signal? It's pretty small, and there's a lot of noise down in the weeds there. And others said, I'll just wait and see how this paper checks out with others before I decide whether I want to collaborate with you, as I asked to work on additional things. And then a couple of other reactions were, what does this mean for calibrating argon-argon dating using uranium-lead ages? Because the uranium-lead, we think of that system as our gold standard. What if we can calibrate that in the argon-argon system against it? But what if we don't really know the ages that, what ages apply when we do uranium-lead dating? I hope to talk a little bit more about this for my talk, but there just isn't time to do that. And then there was the reaction that, well, you do realize now that the domes are remobilized mush, don't you? So this is when mush had not really become sort of an everyday term for us. And I wanted to call out this paper. It's actually a response to a reply to a comment that Gail Mahood gave. And she was trying to, the idea was to try to explain why there were isochrons, 1 to 2 million isochrons, preserved by the glass mountain rhyolites. It seemed to suggest that, again, long storage times for melts, and in this case also associated with Long Valley caldera. And so she suggested that maybe these magmas can be frozen in as a crystallized rind or a mobile mush, and a portion of it can then later be defrosted. Now, she was not the first to recognize this idea that, we're forming these rinds of partially crystallized material, but she was amongst the first, and this idea of defrosting a mush has become much more commonplace in our thinking about these systems. So with that in mind, I thought, well, here's the glass mountain rhyolites up here, but what about the big Long Valley caldera eruption, the Bishop Tuff? A cartoon from those days looked kind of like this. Eruption of the Bishop Tuff 760,000 years ago. glass mountain rhyolites over in here, smaller eruptions extending back to almost 2 million years. And the picture was maybe there's this stratified magma chamber with melts that were formed 2 million years ago and then tapped a bit by the glass mountain rhyolites, and then subsequently 1.8, and then later influx of melt, 1.2 million years, so you're building the stratified sequence, and then unknown ages for the deeper parts that then erupts to form this compositionally zoned Bishop Tuff. So I had one of those, in the shower moments where you go, I think I could do something about this. But as you'll realize, 760,000 years is too old for uranium thorium dating, but we were starting to make progress on the ion probe where we could start to do excellent analyses at the sub-million year level, and so this seemed like a perfect opportunity to do that. So what I did is I did both section zircons, but I also did the first really surface ages for those zircons to try to confirm that the dates that I was getting, which you would expect the rims to be eruption aged. It turns out life is more complicated in the real world, but in this case, it turns out that we could get good results on those. So I won't go into the details of this other than to show you that the crystallization ages for the Bishop Tuff, which are shown here in this green curve, actually are quite close to the eruption age of the Bishop Tuff. And so the crystallization ages are within a few, several tens of thousands of years. They don't remember this earlier history to a large degree. There's very little carryover from the glass mountain rhyolites, which are shown here and have formed these two peaks at the times when actually those were erupting. Since that work, Katie Chamberlain has come along and she's narrowed this pre-eruption time to less than 12 million years. So here's the striking contrast between a very large, voluminous eruption that seems to have a very short lag time between when zircon crystallizes and when eruption occurs, versus the things I showed you from the moat, which had much longer time periods. So we were kind of off and running at this point, and since then, as of 2015 in Carrie Cooper's compilation, she shows all the analyses that have been done on pre-eruption crystal resonance for zircon. So the time between, when zircon was crystallizing is gauged by uranium lead and when it was actually carried to the surface by an eruption. There's a lot of information on here. In addition to showing spot analyses in zircon, so ion microprobe related things, there are also bulk thermal ionization mass spectrometry ages shown. And you can see if you can, I don't know how easy it is to see in the back, but you can see if you look at where the colored dots are, the dots tend to be within 10 and 100,000 years of eruption, but extending back into the few hundreds of thousand-year ranges. In addition, shown on here are uranium lead ages in cases like the Bishop Tuff, where we were able to actually discern the different time differences with enough precision to be able to report it. Very few ages, as I've circled here, are within error of eruption. All right, so where I'd like to take you then with the rest of the talk, and again, kind of focusing on the work we did at the time, but the developments that have subsequently occurred, and just sort of calling out some studies, is now armed with these age determination on individual crystals. We can couple them with chemical analyses. Not always great in the case of zircon. Zircon's not, the best, for giving us a lot of variety and information, but some information that I will show you. And increasingly the use of thermometry based on, actually titanium and zircon thermometry. And from that, we can look at records of magma assembly. So for example, the duration and persistence of melt, secular changes in magmatic temperatures and composition and storage conditions, and insights into the lead up to eruption. So, some people said, zircon's too old. Let me just kind of help frame where we go the rest of the way by saying, is zircon really too old? What are the considerations that sort of help to inform this? So this is an illustration from Casey Turney's paper this year, and it might take a little while to digest it, so I don't expect you to necessarily jump right on this, but the point being here is if we think of a cooling system, zircon actually crystallizes relatively early in the system, and in this case, the youngest Toba Tuff and a low silica rhyolite, well before quartz and sanidine crystallizes. So it's reasonable to expect that there could be, that if we wanted to think about what mineral might give us the oldest time frame for a given volume of melt, zircon is amongst those, and plagioclase as well. Zircon's also despite its high density, it's also typically pretty small. And what that means is it's relatively buoyant in silicic melts. And so this was an illustration I did in the original paper, because I was puzzled by this as well, is why would zircon stick around so long? Well, it turns out it'll stick around a lot longer than plagioclase will, for example. So for the viscosity that I estimated for the moat lavas, plagioclase is much more likely to settle, 100% loss here, when zircon's still being, largely retained. Together, those features mean that it's also easily recycled. And so this is an illustration from a recent paper, and it's a little complicated to follow, but what I really wanted to illustrate is that zircon can remain in the melt for long periods of time. If it's entrapped within another crystal or just eventually settles out and becomes part of the mush, there may be stages of rejuvenation, like I mentioned earlier, during which we start to melt the system, juice it up a bit, and as liquids are expelled from that mush, they may entrain zircon crystals. Oh, okay, sorry, jumping ahead again. All right, so what that's led me to suggest is that on the one hand, zircon is going to remember the total duration of a system potentially, or a significant fraction of the duration of that system. But I've also found myself saying, oh, it's a faithful tracer of liquid because it's so buoyant, it tends to go where the liquid goes. But I also wonder how much it's just a fickle friend. It doesn't really, it goes with whatever melt is around. So it's just going to follow the latest, best melt that it sees. All right. One of the consequences of doing the geochronology work, especially on individual crystals, is then it became really possible to talk really rigorously about crystal identities. And so while we're all familiar with xenocrysts and phenocrysts, and we recognize the xenocrysts are the ones that are significantly older than the time of basically the main population in a melt, we can subdivide the phenocrysts now into things that look like they may have been recycled from the mush and this rigid rind from those that actually appear to have grown from a given liquid. And so this has led to the terminology of anticrysts and autocrysts. So again, now really starting to tease out what is the population within a system telling us. And I want to show you some examples of this, but also some of the other things that we've learned by making these distinctions. So here is a study that Jorge Vasquez and I did of the Central Plateau member in Yellowstone. Shown here are, at the time, all the existing zircon ages for, in this case, the pre-Central Plateau members are all shown in blue, and then the Central Plateau members are shown in red. And what you can see is there's a couple of clear anticrysts here, things that are carried over from the previous eruptions, or the magmas responsible for the previous eruptions. And we would probably today, everyone would agree that these are also carried over from some previous stage of activity within the system. And then a population here that you might consider autocrysts, the ones that are really faithfully recording what the processes responsible for the Central Plateau member. Now, Mark Stelton's come along and done quite a bit more analyses of these things. I'll show a little bit of that later. And in fact, you could then even take this population these days and start to break it down into ones that you think were crystallizing close to eruption and those that are telling us about processes before that. Charlie Bacon and Jake Lowensterns were really amongst the first. They had a couple other studies as well, but first to really start to look at blocks that were entrained within melts. And they looked at some partially melted plutonic granodioritic blocks that were entrained in lavas associated with Mount Mazama. And the locations for those blocks are shown in the colored symbols here. And the location of a rhyolite, 27,000-year-old rhyolite that erupted is here. And this black curve shows you the population distribution for the zircons contained within that rhyodacite. And what they concluded was that these blocks were basically that plutonic rocks were forming at times like these for the yellow and the green, red off here in this portion of the system that were contemporaneous with other volcanic activity. So we're simultaneously forming volcanic and plutonic rocks, really confirming our ideas about this, magma being transferred into solidified domains or partially solidified domains relatively quickly. And then the rhyodacite itself has picked up populations that were also partially solidified and then apparently remobilized, close in time to the time of its eruption, but also carrying over older anticrysts coming from these more solidified domains shown by this illustration down here. We also have found that by a number of different ways, taking the section grains, but also by looking at, starting at the surface of a grain and then progressively sputtering into a grain, we could determine the distribution of ages with a very fine scale resolution, because we're not potentially mixing different domains together with a spot analysis. And you can see in these cases, this is from the youngest Toba tuff, and the distinction here between high and silico-rhyolite is not really the point of my talk so much, but you can see that as you progress into the grains at these scales of microns, you can see a rather dramatic increase in age from the near surface well into the crystals, with the deepest parts still being, being hundreds of thousands of years before eruption, but these are not xenocrysts that are being carried over. This is representing times earlier in the history of the magma when things were crystallizing. In some cases, the rims are eruption aged. In some cases, they actually seem to be older. And so maybe these crystals are things that are being brought into the magma in an environment either in which crystallization is not favored, or there's just not enough time for significant crystallization. And we can also look at the distinctions here, and what you can see right away is that the low silico-rhyolite has a much more variation in its chemical composition than the high silico-rhyolite, which says something about exposure of those magmas inputs from deeper. Jorge Vasquez then also developed the approach of looking at alunite, and he's continued with that work in a number of different locations. One of the beauties of doing alunite, so first of all, we can date it using the ion microprobe, but second of all, it has a great, we have the ability to spatially constrain a wide range in space on an alunite. Alunite's big, we can get a lot of detail. And so here's a crystal, 84,000 years to 193,000 years, 66 to 103. So now seeing kind of similar kinds of time frames, the things we're talking about, but as it turns out for Toba, not quite as long as what we see with the zircon. But there's also wide variations, wide excursions in compositions that are well represented here. And I think I animated this, let's just see, where we start out with relatively evolved compositions, becomes more or less evolved, and then it nearest to the rim, it becomes more evolved. So the alunite is seeing a diverse range in conditions over its lifespan. And finally, another example where we're combining geochronology and composition is this from the iconic, really, Fish Canyon Tuff. It's one of the largest, not the largest eruption that we know about, 5,000 cubic kilometers. And what I hope you can see from this is that these are individual zircons, and I want you to focus on the purple ones. That's the Fish Canyon Tuff. There's other data here. And what you see is there's about 400,000 years of history represented here. Now, in this case, these are single crystal analyses. They're not spatially constrained, so they may be mixing information a bit. But nevertheless, you can also see that there's this, excursion from in the heavy rare earths, ytterbium dysprosium ratios, from values that you would predict based on the host that they're in to values that deviate widely from that and are explained then by 200,000 years of being at near solidus condition, where titanite was crystallizing and fractionating the heavy rare earths. And then, over a long period of time, again, 200,000 years, a period where this thing is juicing up and getting ready for eruption. So not a short period that we sometimes see, and I'll talk about later, but actually a relatively long period in this case. So where that leaves us then is that we can think about these radiometric clocks as integrating the entire history up to the lead up to a volcanic eruption, where we have potentially intermittent growth. I meant to mention that with the Toba depth profiles. I apologize, I forgot. But when you do statistical analyses, then it looks like there are periods of growth separated by periods where there was very little growth and maybe even resorption. So we have evidence that there's intermittent zircon growth. We have evidence that zircons can be recycled from the crystal brine, so parts of the magma system that reached subsolidus conditions. And we also have evidence that some domains have been near solidus conditions before being rejuvenated and remobilized and potentially erupting. So one of the questions that I was really fascinated by is how long does it take to supersize an eruption? And I don't know how this will stand the test of time. We don't talk about supersizing meals so much anymore, but I thought it was a fun title. But We can also modify that and just say, how long does it take to stage an eruption? So this is sort of, depending on your perspective, you may have a different perspective about what does it mean to stage an eruption. Are we talking about the last little event that happens right before the eruption occurs, or how long does it take to assemble everything that ultimately comes out in that eruption? So I wanted to look at some examples of that. Before I do that a little bit, I wanted to bring in the Zircon really too old question again. There's been some recent efforts to try to really model, what does it take for a given set of magma fluxes to produce super, eruption-sized magmas. And the answer depends in part on what is the pre-existing conditions when these melts are being intruded. Is it relatively cool conditions, in which case we really need to inject that magma really quickly in order to be able to generate large volumes responsible for super eruptions in order to be able to keep it from freezing. So that it's all about partitioning this incoming liquid between whether it's going to become more solidified or whether it's going to stay in an eruptible form. If the upper crust is already pre-warned in some fashion, and an example of this is Ozge Karakas's work, where she's allowed lots of intrusion into the lower crust to cause the geothermal gradient just to become, to steepen shallow, and basically heat up the upper crust. And as a result of that, we don't need to have such crazy fast intrusions into the upper crust to be able to start to support a Yellowstone-sized super eruption. And these kinds of slower rates of intrusion are easier to reconcile with many of our observations about the systems, including how quickly the upper crust can respond to, this ballooning magma volume, whether it's mostly crystals or mostly liquid. There's been recent efforts, Luca Caricci's work, to try to say, well, maybe we can use zircon, again, age distributions in zircons, as proxies for magmatic fluxes, with different distributions being predicted depending on whether the final volume is going to be super eruption sized or whether it's going to be smaller, and also whether there's great high rate of magma fluxes, in which case the age distributions tend to skew towards the eruption age, or whether it's lower volumes, in which case they tend to skew to something further back. All right, to really look at the staging question, it's really helpful to bring in other sources of insights into the timescales. And two basic approaches of these involve thinking about things kinetically. One of them is rates of diffusional relaxation of heterogeneity. So imagine a crystal has some sort of a heterogeneity, maybe a curve like this or a step function like this. And we can ask, given what we know about diffusion coefficients and some projection about temperature, which is critical, we can think about how long does it take for this anomaly to diffuse away, say from this step function to a shape like this. We can also look at rates of crystal growth and crystal size distribution. And this field was already pretty well along its way at the time the Zircon work started up. This was really just getting, starting to reach, a kind of peak fertility, and it's really taken off in the last few years. Well, maybe last decade. You guys probably have all seen some version or heard some version of a cartoon like this, where depending on, what part of an elephant you're, have your hands on, you have a different perception of what it looks like. So whether it looks like a big snake, or it looks like a tree trunk, or whether it looks like a little furry mouse if you're out at the tail, it depends on your perspective where you're coming from. And in many ways, I feel like this is what we find when we start looking at the diversity of crystals that we find within these eruptions. We've been talking about zircon and uranium, thorium, lead, radiometric dating, and to some extent limited chemical zoning, but we can also apply things like kinetic clocks and U-series to sanidine, and what I want to show you up here, and kinetic clocks to quartz as well. Some people find this very frustrating. I think this is a wonderful richness that we can use to really start to separate one process from another, and I hope I can give you a little bit of a flavor for that with the remainder of my talk. Before I do that, I want to say a little bit about what Zircon remembers, and especially this idea of temperature and what we know about temperature. We know that there are conditions at which zircon is not going to crystallize. The melt is undersaturated. The pioneering work of Watson and Harrison, and then Harrison and Watson in terms of dissolution rates, really helped us think about, well, what are those conditions and what do they look like? So what we can imagine is a scenario, and this is modeling again that Casey Tierney did for the youngest Tobitoph and a low silica rhyolite, is you can imagine that we have plagioclase crystallizing, probably through this entire interval, and then eventually we attain the conditions at which zircon saturation occurs. And zircon and plagioclase then are co-saturated and crystallize together over a wide interval, as shown in this illustration down here. What we can then say is that, we can start to distinguish between how long, if we bring in dissolution rates, how long we could have one of these events that reheats it and causes maybe that potentially, or raises the possibility that we reverse this trend and we start to leave the solidus or the saturation conditions. And what I did in the case of Deer Mountain and South Dead Man Dome, I was able to suggest that, I just realized there's a typo there, sorry. I realized that temperatures did not exceed zircon saturations for periods of longer than 1,000 years, for more than 200,000 years. So there could have been little excursions keeping the magma system alive, but it wasn't enough to raise it above the zircon saturation temperature for very long at all in this interval between the initial saturation and the time the eruptions occurred. This sort of thinking is prevalent now in how we approach understanding zircon crystallization ages. Is what is it telling us about conditions of whether we're zircon saturated or not, and for what periods of time. I want to turn a little bit to, and I'll come back to this topic of temperature here in a second, but I wanted to turn to Mount St. Helens, so not a super eruption, smaller eruption, but Carrie Cooper and I went back and reinterpreted Alan Volpe's results for Mount St. Helens. And what he'd done is he determined plagioclase ages, or plagioclase disequilibria for not just uranium decaying to 230 thorium, but also for thorium-230 decaying to radium-226, which has a half-life of 1,600 years, as opposed to 75,000 years for the decay of uranium, basically 230 thorium. And with sort of new insights into, I think, what we could call best practices for how to interpret these ages, because there are the influences of melt inclusions on the crystals, there could be influences of multiple populations. What Carrie was able to show is that here's a comparison between the radium-thorium ages, so refined radium-thorium ages and thorium-uranium ages, and you can see that they do not yield concordant ages. They don't lie on this line here. And the thorium-uranium ages are older than those of radium-thorium, and so she explained this by, as an illustration really, because there are many pathways that could produce this, but as a simple illustration, you could mix a young period of growth with an old period of growth, something that was, old with respect to radium-thorium, and produce this distribution. So an old population being between 30 and 50,000 years, and about a 50-50 proportion of those old crystals and young crystals. But as I say, multiple pathways can get you there, but they tell you that there have to be more than one population present. Subsequently, Lily Claiborne came along and with Calvin Miller came along, and they did uranium-thorium disequilibrium dating of zircon from Mount St. Helens, and I won't try to talk you through the details of this, but I wanted to illustrate the same thing they found in 18 samples from 4 main eruptive episodes, a vast array of zircons. So again, in a relatively small system and small plumbing system, there's a diverse range in zircon ages telling you that zircon has been crystallizing over 400,000 years, essentially the life of the volcano. By itself, not so surprising, but those zircons then actually get carried up to the surface in subsequent eruptions, most of which cluster down in here. With the development of the titanium and zircon thermometer by Watson and Harrison, it became possible to now actually estimate temperatures for individual zircons of individual known ages, and also do chemistry like the hafnium concentration as a proxy for differentiation. And what they were able to show is, if this is our trend of increasing differentiation, the earlier lavas are relatively cool, they give low temperatures, and they have they're relatively evolved in their composition, as indicated by these gray circles. And then later zircons, the zircons crystallizing and carried in later eruptions, having a wider range in hafnium. Also, from relatively less evolved to relatively more evolved compositions and up to warmer conditions. So the volcano is heating up, the system's juicing up, we're getting greater potential for eruption. I mentioned the diffusion timescales, and so what we find for these, if we look at, again, so this is Casey Tierney's work. He's done a really fabulous job of looking at the distribution of what we inferred were step functions, may not have been, but they give you a starting point. What the relaxation from step functions across individual cores. So starting more rimward here, more coreward here, you can see there's an increase from 140 years to 1,400 years, consistent with what you would expect. Older zones have been around longer. They've diffused more than the younger zones. And what you would project from these is that the quartz appears to have been crystallizing for up to about 2,000 years. Now, if there stops and starts, it could be longer than this. So this is just a minimum age for that. And in contrast, the mean zircon ages are more than 200,000 years before eruption. This kind of discrepancy that we've seen between uranium-thorium ages and thorium-radium ages was compiled by, how are we doing on time? Okay, was compiled by Cooper and Kent. And, you know, it's an observation that's observed in many, many different volcanoes. But let's remember that the radiometric clocks are temperature independent, and so they are really telling us about absolute time. And again, telling us that maybe multiple populations have been crystallizing over that time. Whereas the diffusion clocks tend to be much shorter, but they're also thermally activated. And so what we can imagine, and this is from their Cooper and Kent's paper, or Kerry Cooper and Adam Kent's paper, is that with these excursions to higher temperature and lower temperatures, there's periods in which, okay, the radiometric clocks remember everything, but there's a period in which the diffusional clocks are only activated, and some window that you can describe depending on your system for that activation. So the diffusion clocks may be telling us something about the duration of eruptibility conditions, whereas the radiometric clocks are really telling us about crystal assembly. So 5 minutes to finish, 5 minutes to finish, hard finish.
Just aim for 3.
Okay, I have more than enough, so I gotta decide what I want to count. Okay, so a couple more illustrations, and I think I'll hit the main, other than the late stage rims. You know, here's another case where we have differences, in this case, between radiometric ages for zircon and for alunite in the youngest Toba tuff. And so these cannot be differences due to whether or not the crystals had stored below diffusional activation conditions. These are radiometric clocks. They're telling us something about the entire duration. So what we think this is really, this is telling us about the total period in which the system is saturated with respect to zircon, whereas alunite saturation appears to occur at lower temperature and not surprisingly gives us younger ages. I think a really more astonishing result is this one, again, relying on radiometric ages, so we're not thinking about whether temperature is playing a role or not, is from the Central Plateau member where the zircons in their interiors yield older, relatively old ages, kind of the time frames that we've been talking about, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years before eruption. But when you look at the zircon rims, they're within age of eruption, and more strikingly, the sanidine. Is also as a bulk sanidine separate, giving ages that are within air eruption. So these together suggest that sanidine did not really, if it had been crystallizing before, it's been resorbed, it's gone from the system, or it was kept locked up in the mush, and only the zircon was carried into the liquid, and then subsequently sanidine and zircon crystallized. Oh, I have to show this one last thing. So I've been looking for an opportunity. This is kind of a gratuitous slide, but I just really want to give a nod to Calvin Miller and Jonathan Miller, and I don't know who took the bigger role in this and who wants to disclaim it the most, but they introduced me to the rocks in the Colorado River Extensional Corridor, and one of the things they described was the crunchy granite. And, the crunchy, granola bar is perfect. It's this rock that just breaks apart really easily, and the idea being that this is kind of a may have been a mush-dominated reservoir where there isn't really enough liquid remaining to cause the crystals to crystallize well. And I take my students out there on field trips regularly, and I show them crunchy granite, and they all get it. They can all tell me what the mush is. And so I really want to show this because this is really an example of the kind of thing that we've been talking about, the idea that we have crystals that get isolated in the cumulate and potentially the sanidine, crystals like zircon that may be isolated in the cumulate but may be pulled into the extracted melt. And they can see these relationships in the Searchlight Pluton in the Colorado River Extensional Corridor. So I think I may have, oh yeah, there we go. Oh, Okay, so I was going to say something about late-stage growth, but I won't. Only a couple of slides. If you came to my talk earlier this morning, you got to hear it already. So I just wanted to remind us that we now really think about these systems as being transcrustal magmatic systems that really, in where we have cases of super eruptions, these remake the crust entirely. They're just completely overprinting whatever existing crust was there. I hope I've convinced you at least that, although I missed some of my TOBA examples, but that they're assembled incrementally and episodically and at a variety of scales. And they can be stored in semi-solid state. I'm not suggesting all systems approach that, but we do see plenty of evidence that they do. And the part I didn't get to describe, but as you will have seen if you think about these systems, is that we do have these rims that suggest that large volumes can be flashed into eruption within, on the order of tens to hundreds of years. And finally, although I briefly touched on it, I think it's really important for us to be thinking about the extent to which this regulator for this crustal differentiation process through transmagmatic plumbing systems is determined by the rates of deep-seated melting and melt accumulation. All right, thank you.
For those who have questions, please line up at the microphone in the middle of the room so that we
Or
can...
don't.
No, Mary would love to have questions, and we have time for 2 or 3 questions.
Is there water that I can grab? I don't see anybody anyway, so. Nobody wants to call attention themselves.
People are being shy to ask the question, so I will ask a question. Mary, where do you think this field is going, given new instrument capabilities coming online? Will there be new opportunities that are enabled by new instrumentation?
Well, I mean, I think that what we're saying, I'm certainly not in a position to be an expert on this, but certainly we're finding that there are ways to get results more rapidly using, for example, laser ablation methods. We're able to get better refinement using more sensitive, secondary ion mass spectrometry methods. I think there's still the opportunity to push the boundaries on uranium thorium disequilibrium dating in situ and being able to resolve those ages better, because one of the challenges is always the uncertainties are fairly large on our ages relative to the kinds of scales of processes that we want to look at. And so better refinement of techniques, I think, for in situ analyses is possible, and I think it would be beneficial. And then, the other big question is for the diffusion ages, what kinds of temperatures are pertaining, what kind of thermal histories, can we tease those out in some way to help resolve those? Looks like Francis is, if I recognize that silhouette.
Mary, I have one
no,
question for you. There's a world in which we look at the magmas through the zircons, and then there is a world where we look through major phases.
Yes.
What do you think in terms of their relationship, and whether they really tell the same story, whether obviously they're complementary, but...
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was hoping to convey the message that they're complementary. And also the fact that we do have these variables at play. When does a given mineral become saturated with respect to any given melt? And the melts can vary over time, and they can vary in space. And so this is a pretty complicated, messy problem that we're trying to bite off with these simple, and I acknowledge, I'm taking a simple-minded approach that each one of us working on our own magmatic systems has to delve into much more detail. But certainly I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, but I will try here, is that in the sense that I do think there's power in combining the two systems. I think we need to be doing that in order to really understand what's going on. Looking at radiogenic phases within minerals is a powerful technique to be able to start to put some constraints on. There's been some successes with that lately, where we can now say radiometrically, we know when this crystal crystallized, what is the diffusion age for this crystal, and how do those two things compare is, I think, a powerful way to combine those two things. But we do have the question, like you say, what's the saturation conditions? Are phases locked up, permanently, the major phases? Does zircon really get out of the melt? When the zircons we see in the youngest TOBA, they're pretty big. They don't look like things that have been included in minerals, but they're still probably pretty mobile. So
it's just when you sometimes look at the temperature records, they don't line up that well, right?
Yeah, no, temperature is, I think, an area we need to do some more work on. because of some of the uncertainties in the methods. But that's a good area for future research.
Let's thank Mary once again. We're going to start in, no, wait, 1 minute. 1 minute. We're supposed to start at 11:20, and so the idea is to have a minute to transition. Okay. So welcome again. The VGP Bowen Award Committee was delighted to be able to select 2 awardees this year, and hence we have 2 Bowen lectures. The second Bowen lecture will be given by Graham Pearson from the University of Alberta. His citation is Steve Shirey from the Carnegie Institution of Washington, the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism.
Thank you, Michael. Graham Pearson merits the 2019 Norman L. Bowen Award for adding to our fundamental understanding of igneous processes in the upper mantle through the studies of volcanic rocks, exhumed mantle sections, subcontinental mantle samples, and diamonds and their inclusions. Graham has tackled the major topics in mantle geochemical evolution with a research toolkit that ranges from petrography, mineralogy, petrology, through stable isotopes, radiogenic isotopes, pseudophile elements, and spectroscopy. In using these techniques, Graham has sought new analytical method developments that push the frontiers of analytical sensitivity and precision. Those familiar with Graham's work will remember a long list of discoveries, such as large pieces of the Earth's mantle were emplaced from the diamond stability field. Eclogite xenoliths and kimberlite occurred as Archean subducted oceanic crust. Continental mantle keel ages match with their overlying crust. Rhenium osmium sulfide age dating of single sulfide inclusions in diamond. Kimberlite derivation from unique mantle sources. The osmium imprint of oceanic mantle in the oceanic mantle of continental crust extraction. Trace element abundances in gem diamonds and source fingerprinting. A modern subduction analog for Archean Kraton formation. And the finding in a super deep diamond of the first terrestrial ringwoodite, a truly amazing list of discovery. In this latter accomplishment, we see an example of why Graham is especially Bowen Award deserving. He led the effort to successfully measure the water content of a delicately metastable single grain of ringwoodite while encased in the diamond. He did this so it could avoid the breakdown and thereby retain all its original water. In perhaps one of the most important mineral analyses ever made, Graham and co-workers were able to show directly that the ringwoodite had 1.5 weight% water. For the first time, here was confirmation that the mantle transition zone could be wet. In consideration of the sum and diversity of his contributions, we honor Graham Pearson for the wide interdisciplinary influence of his work in understanding the mantle at all depths.
Well, thank you, Steve, for some generous and flattering words. And thank you also for those that put the time and the effort in to nominate this award. That was led by Peter Kellerman. Peter's always been a very challenging and stimulating colleague that I've kicked ideas around with over my career. And also Rick Carlson, Steve, and Chris Hawksworth, who were very good enough to nominate me. I've just two things in common. Thankfully, the getting the Bowen Award does not require great skill with phase diagrams, otherwise that would be me out of consideration. But my Canadian citizenship and time spent at the Carnegie Institute of Washington are two things I do have in common with Bowen, and I strongly recommend both. My career, especially if you have an orange buffoon as president, but anyway, my career has been blessed actually with a series of fortunate events. I think I've had a great deal of luck, especially with fruitful collaborations with a long list of very talented people, too numerous to mention here, but too important to ignore. We really do get a very brief word limit here, and so it isn't possible to thank everybody that I really would like to thank. On entering university, I wanted to be a mining geologist. And that's something I still pretend to do when visiting diamond mines, but inspiring undergraduate teaching by Bob Thompson at Imperial College diverted my path. Having two amazing PhD supervisors, Peter Nixon and Gareth Davis, were really key to pushing me on my way through life. Peter's infectious fascination, in particular, with the mantle and his personal integrity are things that I still aspire to. The postdoc mentors of the stature and generosity of Steve Shirey, Rick Carlson, Joe Boyd, and Chris Hawksworth really gave me no excuse to fail, and so I ended up at Durham, and after 15 happy years there, I was lured to Canada, where I'm really blessed with truly supportive colleagues who make my life at the university a real pleasure. I want to end by focusing on a group of people that don't often get the credit they deserve in these citations, and that's really the lab technical support that I've had through time. So without the dedication, enthusiasm, and support of a long lineup of lab managers that I've had, then I really wouldn't have got very far. So I'd just like to end by thanking Jeff Knoll, Chris Otley, Sarah Woodland, Yan Lowe, Churndeep Sarkar, names that some of you may not have heard of, but were actually just essential along with the students and postdocs in getting me to this stage in my career. And finally, my heroic wife, Sam, who's a biochemist who's had to tolerate a lot of geology speak over the period of time. And those people rightly own some part of this award. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the underside of continents. I guess this Bowen Award has some symmetry in that Mary talked about the upper parts of continents and their magmatic processes, and I'm going to focus on the underneath, beneath the continents. And I would like, as we go through this, to acknowledge some major contributions from the following people on here: Hongliang Wang, Jeroen van Hoonen, Chris Silas, Jingao Liu, James Scott, and Andrew Schaefer, who've all contributed to the work that I'm going to show you. And I'd like to show the photograph of the people that I just named in words, and I will reiterate again just what great mentors these people are. I try and aspire to the quality of mentorship they gave me. I'm not sure I get close, but I do try. So I went and had a look through Bowen's publication list, and it seems as though it's pretty extensive, as you would imagine, and it seems as though he did experiments on pretty much every kind of rock you could imagine, except that he studiously ignored the residues from partial melting. And this probably turned out to be a very smart move on his part, because he was obviously a smart guy. Because despite the mineralogical simplicity of these rocks, this is a simple three-phase Harzbergite, their origin has occupied, it has generated a lot of argument over the past 100 years. And that argument still goes on today. And hopefully I'll show you my views on how these rocks formed. As I've said, the contribution to this is a lot from my research group at the University of Alberta. There we are, just to prove that there's not always snow on the ground up in the frozen north. But I am going to emphasize it's a personal view. This isn't a review, and so I have to apologize to actually the many people in the room that have contributed as much or probably more than I have to this topic. But you're going to get my view today. I've been fortunate enough to have been in receipt of a Canada Excellence Research Chair, which has allowed me to visit a lot of places in Canada, actually, a lot of places that very few people get to go, and sample kimberlites and mantle xenoliths to try and put together a picture of what the continental mantle looks like under Canada. And you'll have to forgive the slight biasness towards the Canadian geography here. We ended up getting up to 80 degrees north up here on Ellesmere Island, and we're surprised to find a sign saying 80 degrees north. But we're also surprised to find a US listening station there, which when you approached, there was some voice from Virginia that told you to back off and go away. I think it also muttered the words, "the call was perfect" as well. I'm not quite sure. It was a bit windy, but and then we left. So the thread of this story is going to go something like this, hopefully, if I get the time to fit it all in. And seeing as Michael's forgotten to start the timer here, I guess I'm okay. Ah, you are. I'm going to start by looking at a Kraton definition, and then we'll look at the age relationships in these things that we call Kratons. I'm going to take a look at the oldest components because I think that's important in terms of addressing arguments about how they might have formed and driving models of how they might have formed. And then I'm going to look at how the rocks form and then how the root formed. And those are not the same thing, but although they're often confounded as the same thing by people driving models of Kraton formation, in my mind anyway. And then we'll come to some modern analogs, which might be Kratons that will form in the future. So here's a sort of cartoon view of the continental lithosphere. And while it's pretty well known, the fact that the structure beneath the Kratons here, the older parts of the continents, is much thicker than the structure than the continental lithosphere in areas of thinned crust. This relationship between the circumcratonic zones and the Kratons is less clear, and we're going to visit that as we go along. And actually, as you may have already gathered from my remarks, making Kratonic roots is a really contentious business. And here are a few examples of some of the many models that have been put forward. And again, you're going to get my view on this. But that's actually what's made this such a fun field. I frequently tell my students that if the answer's obvious, we'd all be out of business pretty quickly. And some of those end-member models can be summed up. A lot of people have summarized diagrams like this, and I did this in 1999, and I don't see a big reason to change it. It sort of summarizes the end-member models that are usually put forward and some of the age structure, both in the crust and in the continental lithosphere, you might expect to see in a very simplistic way. And as of course, when you'll see as I show you the data, it's going to be nothing like that. And we're going to use as our viewpoint ultramafic rocks, mostly in the form of mantle xenoliths. So these are mantle xenoliths brought up by kimberlite pipes. They're actually very large mantle xenoliths. These are house bricks, in case there's any aspiring geophysicists in the audience. These things are, this is from Kimberley, where they couldn't crush these things up in the old days of extracting diamonds. And so these are probably some of the biggest mantle xenoliths you'll get to see. And if you start your career like me, collecting on these things, then going to other places in the world, I mean, if you know that's a 3-foot-long sledgehammer, then when you go to other places in the world, like West Greenland, that's a 10-centimeter-long pen, then life is a little bit more difficult. But nonetheless, there are samples there, and if you work hard enough, then you can recover them. And we're also going to take a look at some ultramafic rocks emplaced in some of the oldest parts of Kratons in West Greenland here as well. But let's start with the term Kraton and the definition, which was originally defined by Kober in 1921. He used the term cratogen, and it merely implied long-term stability of a crustal region. There was no precise age definition. Yet its widespread use, particularly by people like me, unfortunately, has arrived at a situation where the focus is on the Archean part of the Kraton, and almost Archean and Kraton have become synonymous, and that was not the original use. And I'd like to revisit this very briefly and propose that we go back to something much more like Kober's original definition, particularly because many Kratons have extensive post-Archean tectonic histories and components. So here's a summary map that we put together several years ago of most of the world's Kratons, and you can see the red dashed lines outline these large contiguous regions that when people talk about, say, the Siberian Crater, they really mean this huge area there, despite the fact that the actual Archean component of that Kraton is rather small. And even within these shields, the Anabar and Alden shield, there's a complex patchwork of Proterozoic rocks as well as Archean rocks. And that goes for many of these other places. The Amazonian Kraton is another good example. Here we are. Here's a little bit more detail on the Amazonian Kraton, and you only have to look at the colors and the age componentry down here of what makes up these cratonic blocks in the Amazonian Kraton to realize that Proterozoic rocks actually make up a very large proportion of them. The same can be said for the Ray Kraton here. The Ray Kraton is in Canada. It's one of the world's larger Kratons. It occupies this huge area, probably extending up into Somerset Island up here. And it's peppered with these Nuntulin Hudson 1.9 to 1.75 GA granites right the way through. And then back to the Siberian Kraton. I won't dwell on that. I've already explained what the deal is there. In fact, so much of this white area here is a composite of Meso and Neo-Proterozoic terrains. So despite that difference in age, the fact is that all those regions are still underlain by very thick continental lithosphere. The seismologists have done a great job here. Here's a summary using US array data by Schaefer and Lebedev of 150-kilometer tectonic slice, showing that clearly that actually if you look at the size of the S-wave anomaly here, even there's almost an 8% S-wave velocity anomaly at 150 kilometers. So these roots are very thick, and they extend right across the geological complexity of this region into these Proterozoic areas. And so this thick root plays a key role in stabilizing these regions, and I think in terms of it should play a role in defining them. So I'd like to re-propose a slightly modified version of Kober's definition and maybe give it an age. And I think my view would be that a Kraton should mean a region of continental crust that's been tectonically stable from around about 1.8 GA. I'll show you shortly why I like that age, to perhaps even as young as 1.4 GA in certain areas, due to the long-term presence of a deep 150-kilometer or more lithospheric mantle root. And some Kratons may have lost that root, and they could be referred to as reactivated Kratons. And I think that is a lot more encapsulating as what we actually talk about when we say Kraton, even if we mean another thing. And if we go back to here's a recent summary Andrew Schaefer made me then of S-wave anomalies again, varying from 0 to 8%. And so all this area in North America here, you would term a Kraton, likewise in Australia. I think you get the point. Okay, and one of the reasons that those continental keels have been in place for all that time is because they're residues from very large degrees of partial melting. And you can use the olivines to do this. This is one thing that Peter Kellerman started doing in detail, and we took on and looked at in more detail. And the olivine chemistry, in particular these forsterite-rich olivines with magnesium numbers of 90 to 92.5, really tell you that these rocks have experienced melt depletion on the order of 30 to 40 weight%. That dehydrates them, makes them buoyant and highly viscous, and so when they do decide to underpin a continent, then they stay there until something very dramatic happens. There's a few instances in the modern Earth where rocks get as depleted as that. I've highlighted a couple here. I'm going to come back to those, so I'm not going to dwell on them. Okay, so I've talked a bit about the ages of the crust, but what about the ages of the mantle and its relationship to the crust? And so Mary's talk was a fantastic exposition of what you can do with precise dating. And that you can't do in the Earth's mantle, largely because most of the mantle lithosphere is above the blocking temperature for any of these geochronological systems that we might want to use. There are some parts of lithosphere with cool geotherms that might have a chance of recording intermineral disequilibria and giving ages. But when you look at the deeper continents actually and the sampling that kimberlites give you, really most of that lithosphere is above any blocking temperature which would allow you to get an accurate age. And so we've used osmium isotopes for many years now as probably the most robust and effective chronometer, in that we use this idea that here's the bulk mantle chugging along here, and if you take out melt at any given time, then the different slopes of the red arrows here are proportional to the amount of melt taken out. But if you remove 30 to 48% of melt here, then you pretty much freeze in the osmium isotope composition, and you end up with a depletion age, which gives you the age of that depletion. Now, it's a slightly imperfect chronometer, as anything would be in the mantle. It's subject to metasomatic effects, and so we use filters. We try and focus on highly depleted rocks that are least minimally metasomatized. We have taken to using the platinum group elements as a guide to how much metasomatic modification they may have had. And we look for rocks like this, which, as you can see, are few and far between, where this is the signature of melt depletion. We might get rocks with a little bit of rhenium enrichment, but many rocks have strong rhenium enrichments due to secondary processes, and that's why we don't use the traditional model age approach that you should do for things like samarium neodymium or lutetium hafnium, for instance. And doing that, this is a composite put together of Southern Africa, where we've probably got the most dense sampling. We can see that where you're on the Archean block of the Kraton here, then you have model ages, median and ages that are over 2.5 billion years old, with the exception of the premier, the Cullinan here, right in the middle of the bushveld intrusion. I'll come back to that. And then around the edges of the Archean block, you're still getting very old ages, actually, where the modes are between 1.4 and 2 billion years. Now, in the literature, many people would refer to this as the Kraton and this somehow as circumcratonic. But I think in that new definition I've just given you, then all of this would be cratonic. And even though the ages, certainly of the mantle lithosphere, here you are, there's a huge peak at 1.4 in this part of the Kraton out here, and another peak at 2GA. Now, these areas are still, though, underlined by very deep Archean crust, lithosphere as determined by seismology. So you can see that in the Archean block and out into the Proterozoic block, we've still got between 250 and 160 kilometer lithosphere, and that's backed up by xenolith geotherms, which are essentially identical between localities on and off the Kraton, showing that at least at the time that these kimberlites erupted, there was equally thick lithosphere here and here. And so we look at the geology of Southern Africa, then I'd want to expand that territory or increase its geographic reach. And of course, we can do that with this tool that's become available for extending geographic areas, the truth tool known as the Sharpie pen. And when we do that, then we'd really want to redefine the Kraton as, I would anyway, as something more like this than that much smaller Archean core. So sure, there are Archean cores, but the greater, more stable Kraton, I think, is much larger, much wider in reach. Okay, so I've used this age 1.8 to maybe 2 billion years. What's so important about that? And I'm going to show you some examples of where we're finding more and more evidence that even within the Archean core, we're finding major contributions at those ages to the lithosphere beneath it. And then I'll show you some cratons that you may not have heard of, the Sass Kraton and the Mckenzie Crater, both in Canada, where there is no Archean underlying root there, and the root is of these ages. And I'll quickly go through these. So here's the Siberian Crater, and I've already located you for that. Highly depleted melt residues, the Siberian areas there, smack bang in the middle of our classic highly depleted high forsterite olivine. Here's a compilation that Dmitry Ivanov put together of some of my early data, which actually showed, if I look back on it now, better evidence for 2GA formation than it did for Archean formation, plus some of his new data and other data we've got from some of these localities. And you can see that in the Siberian Craton, there's an equally large mode at 2 billion years as there is down here in the Meso to Neo-Archean. The diamonds, actually, there is no Archean diamond age from the Siberian Craton. The diamonds that have been dated start at 2GA and go down to more recent times. And then here's this huge peak in the crustal age there, when a lot of crust was made, where you had to have very high heat fluxes in the Siberian Craton. And here's just a little example of what you can do with some rather unusual mantle xenoliths. These are mantle xenoliths called alchromites. They're spinel garnet assemblages, and this is the hafnium isotopes on them. And because all the lutetium is in the garnet in these rocks, well, both of them end up giving model ages of about 1.8 billion years. This model age is pretty much like a zircon age, though, because there's virtually no common hafnium in that, and so its evolution line is vertical. So you could almost put the continental crust on here as a reservoir, and you'd still get a model age of 1.8 billion years. So these are subducted components that have ended up in the Siberian lithosphere at 1.8 GA, as that lithosphere in that big craton was amalgamated and stabilized. We'll look at the Ray Craton, which I've already mentioned. And so in detail in the Ray Craton, there are numerous kimberlites that have intruded through the Ray Craton here. And actually, there's really great recent work to build on from David Snyder at the GSC, who's looked at the teleseismic results from this area and finds rather complex structure. Right? The scales are not on here, but so he statistically fitted a number of key boundaries, impedance contrast boundaries in the lithosphere here that show that this is not a boring homogeneous lithosphere here. This is the LAB somewhere down here, which would be about 200 kilometers on this scale. That's geographic distance on the top there. So here we are. Here's a geotherm from there, temperature and pressure. And this is data that we calculate from the xenoliths themselves. And the geotherm that we derive from fitting the PT data points tell us that there was a 200-kilometer thick lithosphere beneath the Ray Craton. Actually, these kimberlites erupted something like 530 million years ago, but thick lithosphere there. And this is the combined rhenium-osmium model age data set. So here's our TRD age, our melting age versus frequency. And we can see that there is an Archean component, a Neo-Archean component, but there's a very strong 1.6 to 1.8 GA component in that lithospheric mantle. Here's the two databases that contributed to that, and in fact, the Pelly Bay locality, which is the further north on that map, has a much stronger 1.8 GA age peak in it than the Repulse Bay peak, and that leads us to actually a rather complex story of lithospheric evolution, where we perhaps had two blocks coming together in the eastern and central ray to form a thick lithosphere originally that was largely, in this case, probably Neo-Archean in age. And then at around 1.8 GA, that lithosphere was reprocessed or replaced in the Paleoproterozoic by younger lithosphere. And the complementary evidence that was likely to have happened is that this is the time when that huge suite of batholiths peppered the crust in the Ray Craton, high heat generation in here, commensurate with removing and replacing the lower part of the lithosphere, and probably squeezing it as well to create enough space to make these granitic melts, to create enough heat. So here's a little schematic of the fact that we get in the shallow lithosphere, we get Archean. This is depth here. This is geographic position. We get Archean ages in the shallow parts and Proterozoic ages in the deeper parts of the lithosphere at the same time that you're making these granitic magmas in the lower crust. And it's actually showing the same thing. The only thing to point out here is that actually we can fit very nicely this transition between Proterozoic and Archean fits beautifully with the depth picks for the seismic structure here. So here we can really do mantle stratigraphy where we can relate age versus depth in the mantle lithosphere. Okay, now to the Mckenzie Crater, which you've probably never heard of, and this is a name that I'm keen on popularizing. It's not my name, but I like it. And this is an area of where there are actually a number of diamondiferous kimbalites up here, way outside the slave Kraton that you might be more familiar with. And again, we find when we look at the xenoliths in those kimbalites that there's 200-kilometer thick lithosphere there. There's diamonds in the kimbalite. Here's the depth versus temperature, so a geotherm plot for the Mckenzie Craton. This is the slave Kraton reference, or is it, hang on. Sorry, the slave Kraton reference is in blue, and then this is the Mckenzie Craton, two localities, Central Victoria Island and Parry Peninsula. Central Victoria Island has equally thick lithosphere as a central slave, well over 200-kilometer thick lithosphere at the time of kimbalite emplacement. The composition of those rocks is also extremely depleted. This is the bulk composition, olivine magnesium number for one of those suites. The other is a bit too altered to analyze the olivines, and it's right in this field of highly magnesium olivine contents with high spinel chrome numbers in both localities here. So it's cratonic-like composition, but the ages are all 2 billion years. There's a hint of something a little bit older here, but the overwhelming age peaks here come in at 2 billion years in the lithosphere beneath these regions. You might say, well, aren't these just reset Archean ages? Well, we don't think that they are for many reasons, actually, but here's one just obvious empirical reason. When you go back and look at the Kapval Kraton, the one anomaly in the Archean core of that Kraton is the Cullinan or Premier kimbalite, which punches its way right through the lithosphere that was reprocessed by the Bushveld intrusion 2 billion years ago. And here's the osmium, the TRD depletion ages for the Kapval Kraton with a giant peak in the Neo-Archean at 2.7. And here is the Cullinan data, where you can still see clearly, actually even a little Meso-Archean peak here, but you can still see the Neo-Archean peak there, and then you see the effect of this reprocessing and new lithosphere being made when around about the time that the Bushveld complex disrupted that lithosphere. And then lastly, the Sask Kraton here, which is probably one of the world's smallest cratons, if not the smallest craton in Saskatchewan, Canada. I told you your geographic knowledge of Canada would improve through this talk. And here is a Sask Kraton. It's trapped by the Trans-Hudson origin. It's a very small craton in here with actually probably the world's biggest kimbalites intruding through it. And those kimbalites provide us with diamonds again. It was imaged originally by seismology, and then some follow-up zircon work found that there are indeed Archean domains there. I'll show you some of the evidence for that. But here's another geotherm, depth, temperature, many samples. In this case, we've used indicator minerals as well as xenoliths to define a 200-kilometer thick lithosphere there 90 million years ago. So that meets my criteria for a craton. And then here's the osmium ages. And again, there's no Archean age. There's this big peak at between 2 billion and 1.8 GA, actually that overlaps the Trans-Hudson orogeny. And these ages, there's overlap here are the crustal ages, but here are the oldest crustal ages in the zircon data, and there's no evidence of that in the lithosphere. So this idea that came about when we first started using osmium data to correlate age of crust and age of mantle, it needs significant modification now. And then there's a little summary of, if you zoom around Canada, looking at the age of the lithosphere there, it's all thick lithosphere, I'll remind you, all with these high S-wave speed anomaly lithospheres there. And you have evidence of Meso to Neo-Archean lithosphere formation, sure, in the central slave, and a very clean signature in new data we've got from Chidliak in Baffin Island. But then the rest of these places either have composite signatures or they have exclusively Paleoproterozoic roots here in these cratons here. And then Sonia Olbach published some data some time ago on what I would euphemistically call the Buffalo Kraton, and I would define this now as a Kraton, 1.9 GA deep roots in that part of the lithosphere there. So I've looked at some of the younger parts of Kraton roots. I think it's important to look at some of the older parts too. Or look for the evidence of what are the oldest components, because it's very tempting from a dynamic point of view to make models of Cratonic lithosphere that perhaps are centered around, well, okay, what happened to, if there was a stagnant lid at, say, 4.2 billion years ago to 4GA, then on the Earth, then that may have been underpinned, it almost certainly must have been underpinned by some sort of residual mantle that crust was taken out of it on the basis that the residual mantle is buoyant. Except there isn't any evidence of that in the geochronological database that we have for lithospheric mantle. And that's really important to remember for driving models of how one might make continental lithosphere. And that might be just because the convection was so vigorous at that time that whatever residual mantle was beneath these areas got eroded away by very vigorous convection. We looked to see whether we could find any evidence of that. We went to West Greenland, where the purple dots here illustrate a number of ultramafic bodies, which we were looking for evidence of residual mantle there. It's pretty tough. A lot of people have done this exercise, and actually distinguishing residues and cumulates there is a lot more difficult than you would think. Spectacular outcrops, not Mantle Xenoliths, but outcrops in hillsides. This is 3.8 billion year Itzhak gneiss, and this is a peridotite body, and the gneiss here intrudes the peridotite. So these ultramafic rocks are actually older than the gneisses in this location. And you can see actually their composition is quite variable. So here's the typical Cratonic mantle territory in terms of olivine, nickel, magnesium number compositions. And this is the swath of compositions that you get from these ultramafic rocks. They're mostly cumulates with rather low olivine Mg numbers and very variable nickel. In fact, they have very variable chromium contents as well that range widely here. And I just mapped on all the unfiltered data for Cratonic xenoliths on here. And actually, I think looking at this persuades me that while these rocks are not residues, they're actually trapped in the shallowest parts of the cratons. I think there's a case to be made that these are actually Cratonic peridotites from much deeper in the Cratonic roots supplied by kimberlites. And there's a case to be made that some of these cumulates in these locations actually end up via this process that I'm going to get into later in the talk as being caught up and forming an integral part of the lithosphere. And so in terms of the age relations, well, here's the residues in West Greenland brought up by the kimberlite xenoliths. Here are the cumulates. Yes, there's some old ages there, but in fact the most reliable ages are between 3.5 and 3.2 billion years. These are probably cumulates from the magmatic rocks that formed the crustal part of a stagnant lid, perhaps, but there is no evidence of any residues in this area, a time span here. It's overwhelmingly much younger ages. I'm going to skip this. Okay. I've said a lot about these rocks so far, but I haven't given you any indication of how they formed, and I will proceed to give you my view of how they formed. So there have been a number of really interesting proposals some time ago, actually, proposing that these Archean peridotite roots might be subducted metaserpentinites, and this was a very attractive hypothesis, one I personally liked, but is resolvable with oxygen isotopes, and it was surprising to me that no one had really tested those hypotheses in a rigorous way. And so using the iron probe at the U of A, my student Margot Regier looked at a whole geographically enormous swath of olivines from Cratonic peridotites from all around the world. There's something like 120 analyses in here, and the narrowness of this is, so this is delta 18O, and these are different peridotite suites. Here's Cratonic olivines, 120 data points or so in an extremely narrow band here that is statistically insignificant from, here's the Morb reservoir, delta 18O of about plus 5.5, and here's the cumulative frequency plot, and statistically you cannot tell the difference between the olivines in Cratonic peridotites and the Morb source, whereas here's a plot for serpentines and Cratonic eclogites. But so clearly We looked at rocks from a big range in garnet chemistry, a big range in magnesium silica, which has been used as a proxy for degree of serpentinization of protolith. And unfortunately, this quite elegant proposal does not stand up to the oxygen isotope test. I think a lot of the momentum in terms of understanding the pressure of melt formation, there are many people that have worked on this, and I'm just going to show a couple of diagrams that I think to me are some of the strongest evidence. This is a very complicated diagram which will take me 10 minutes to explain, and I'm not going to, I'll have to apologize for that. But basically this diagram is designed to show you what are the garnet compositions here along this line that you would predict if you made a garnet by metamorphic reaction at higher pressures, starting from a low pressure precursor, orthopyroxene plus spinel. So here's spinel, here's orthopyroxene. What composition of garnet would you make if you metamorphose rocks that were melted, formed at lower pressure, and stabilized them at higher pressure? Versus the compositions of garnets you would make simply by melt extraction, which are down here in this rather narrow compositional interval, which spans about 2 to 4 weight% chromium. And if you actually look at the span of chromium compositions of natural garnets, you'll see it's huge. And these are garnets from Mantle Xenoliths in the cratonic root there. And all you want to focus on here is the chromium content. It spans way beyond anything you would predict from melt extraction, and in fact spans this entire array that you could predict from the metamorphism of lower pressure residues at higher pressure. That view is supported by an analysis of heavy rare earth element fractionation, where if you start with a primitive mantle here and you fractionally melt the residues, at high pressure melt extraction you will be driven in this direction. There is a turnover depending on where the garnet spinel transition is, and you'll end up back up here, ending around here. And the overwhelming majority of all the data, this is whole rock data for lutetium and ytterbium, the overwhelming majority of the data plot way up here in this extensive low pressure melt array. Now that's not to say that there can't be high pressure melt residues in cratonic roots. There almost certainly are. Melting is a dynamic process in the earth, and there has to be higher pressure melt residues caught up in there. And in the time I've got left available, which is hopefully how long, Dominique? 10 minutes, thank you. Then I'll show you how you can incorporate both high and low pressure melt residues if you want to do that. This is another piece of evidence which I'll come back to maybe later, but again, Peter Kellerman's group started looking at this parameter space, olivine, magnesium number, spinel chrome number, and found these highly depleted compositions in cratonic rocks. Here are some actually much younger rocks in New Zealand, but this is the issue here is explaining these very high magnesium number in olivine, very high chrome number spinels, because this is the anhydrous melt extraction trend to something like 50 weight%, and only experiments in hydrous compositions will get you into this area. In diamond inclusions, you find chromite olivine pairs way up here with chrome numbers of 90 or so, and the only way you can get up there is by melt rock reaction into low pressure residues. And so you can find, for instance, there are periddotites in places like the South Sandwich Islands that have experienced melt rock reaction with maybe a bonanitic melt that has upgraded the chromium to make these very high chrome content spinels. You can't make that from anhydrous igneous processes. Okay, that's how the rocks form, but that's not the same thing as how did the cratons form. And so I'm going to start the how did the cratons form with my view of how they did not form. And I'm going to play a video, which might be quite brave of me because I'm not a video person, but let's see how it, that was very brave, wasn't it? Here we go. Okay, so this was an attempt to model what happens to the residues of mantle plumes. So we're not plotting melt here. We're plotting the vectors of the residues after melting, extracting melt during a mantle plume event. So this is the early stages of the plume event where there's some upwelling going on, but the main plume head has not arrived. And you can see there's various types of turbulence going on here. And then as the main plume head arrives, I keep wanting to point at the screen, which won't be very profitable, will it? Here we are. As the main plume head arrives, you can see that immediately the residues spread out with some rapidity. And sure, it's a model and you can put in different factors, but there is no way of stopping this rapid spread and dispersion of the residues that just keeps going and going. So these residues, sure, they must exist in Earth's mantle, but they get scattered in the winds of this sort of flow and the convective flow, probably in the shallower parts of the mantle, maybe to be collected up later by the sort of process that I'm going to talk about. But just in itself, you can't just put a plume under somewhere and say, oh, and then you're going to stack up all the residues and make a cratonic root. Dynamically, it won't work. There's nowhere on Earth, in the modern Earth, where that works either. That was my backup in case the video didn't work. Okay. But let's look at the geological evidence, if you don't like models. And actually, when you then start poking around at the geological evidence in cratons, you see a story of, and again, I've selected my cratons here, but you can get me onto other cratons if you want, and I'll talk my way around that. But you see a story of linear domains in cratons and linear features in the geology that are not either consistent with a plume assembly view. And then when you look at the seismology, as I've already indicated, you see complexity in the seismology in the roots of cratons. You see a lot of evidence for either dipping reflectors, or if you don't like subduction at that age, that's fine. But indenters is how David Snyder interpreted some of these interfaces in a paper where we looked at Canada's cratons recently, but not simple blocks. So evidence of one craton indenting another laterally. If you look at the superior craton, you're really struck, or at least I am, by the linear nature of the arrays that make up the superior craton here, this almost east-west strike. This is a composite terrain that has been slammed together later on in its life. And again, here's some of the seismology there. Lots of evidence for indenters and dipping reflectors there that you can choose to interpret how you like. And then lastly, the ray craton with this strikingly linear nature to it. Okay, how do you get linear features in the crust? Well, lateral compression would be the way that I would want to do that. And so this is my sort of attempt at dynamic modeling. I think I found the fill function in PowerPoint. But then, and actually, before we get into the real stuff, that I should note that long ago, Tom Jordan and, as Peter Kellerman pointed out to me, Ron Oxper and Parmentier were thinking about lateral accretion of residues to create thicker roots beneath continents a long time ago. And this and some more recent work by Dan Mckenzie really sort of prompted my thinking as to, well, surely there's a lot to this idea that shortening is the way to stabilize these regions and create the fabric that we see. And so here's a model that Jeroen van Hunen showed earlier in the week, and it starts with a depleted layer that we're going to squash. And someone asked Jeroen, well, where does the depleted layer come from? Well, we're talking about the Archean Earth here, between the Meso and Neo-Archean. So this could be, we've modeled it as typical Archean oceanic lithosphere with about 100-kilometer thick depleted oceanic lithosphere there. It could be arc-related residues. It could be plume residues. It doesn't really matter, but there will be abundant depleted residues in the Earth at this time. And if you squash that environment, then, and this is real modeling, not mine. This is done by Hongliang Wang and Jeroen van Hunen. Then you end up with this situation where you can easily generate these thick cratonic roots. It takes time, but you rapidly generate cratonic thickness roots of up to 200 kilometers here within the first 300 million years, faster. They're locally much quicker than that. And then there's this long period of actually what we call gravitational thickening that really thickens the root for some time after that. So the root keeps on thickening when you squash it. And this is the compositional viscosity fields. I'm running out of time to get into the models, which... But another feature of these models is that it's a bit of the Goldilocks syndrome, though, that you've got to have the conditions just right. If you squash these things too fast, you'll destabilize them. And I can't help thinking that this is a likely outcome in the early Earth, which must be, in the words of a Simon Turner paper that I saw on the Archean, it's a record of failure. There must have been many attempts to either A, initiate subduction, or B, to form cratons, and it's not difficult to conceive that some of these things might have formed and might have dissipated because they became unstable. What's the evidence for thickening in these roots? That comes in the form of seismic investigation, SKS splitting, which is essentially the anisotropy fabric of olivine fossilized in the lithosphere there. This is something that Paul Silver at DTM started championing years ago. Here are two more modern studies that show very strong seismic anisotropy in the lower parts of the lithosphere. Here's what is actually the western part of the North Atlantic Kraton in Baffin Island with extremely strong SKS splitting, and also here into the Ray Kraton too. So there's abundant evidence of lateral compression. Perfect. So I just want to finish very quickly, and it will be very quickly, just to give you a modern perspective, because I've been talking about very old rocks, but we've been recently, with James Scott and Jingao Liu, we've been looking at Zealandia, Earth's youngest continent, which is fortunately pierced by a number of alkali basalts bringing Mantle Xenoliths to the surface. And you'd think that these things are young, and so they're going to be compositionally a bit different to Cratonic Xenoliths, but we had a bit of a surprise. The other thing to note with Zealandia is there's no old crust there. There's no crust older than the Cambrian, and an interpretation of the crustal structure is that it is essentially a whole bunch of arcs that have been slammed together. The compositions of these things are really surprising. They're actually more depleted in terms of bulk aluminium content than here are cratons. Here's bulk aluminium. Here are the New Zealand xenoliths. And all but a couple of localities are extremely depleted. And this is in lithosphere beneath Earth's youngest continent. They have extremely depleted, very high chromium number spinels here, very high magnesium number olivines. Is the Zealandia lithospheric mantle Archean? Because composition, it looks like it. No, is the simple answer. So these are the xenolith localities. The blue here are the Dun Mountain ophiolites and a number of other very depleted ophiolites. The xenolith localities, if you just take the xenolith localities, the age distribution of those is statistically indistinguishable from the global abyssal prototype database. So this is newly accreted, highly refractory, highly depleted lithosphere that's docked underneath Zealandia. This is our model, which involves a whole series of arc accretion to form that. And initially, one perceptive reviewer pointed out, yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, maybe it's a craton waiting to be formed. There's no thick lithosphere there. And we had been unscholarly enough to not do our homework, and so we went and looked at the literature more, and lo and behold, there is, underneath the Southern Alps, this 150-kilometer thick root there that formed when this continental mass came together. So I'm going to leave it there. This is, the message is that, yes, we've got this very depleted root underlying old continents. There's plenty of feedstock for new continental roots when you look at the very depleted compositions in the olivine compositions here. And the one last thought to leave you with that I realized last night is that all these cratonic roots that are young or have been reprocessed in the Paleoproterozoic, they all formed over here. This is a plot of age versus cratons, and all these cratons with complex roots actually had a complex life before they all ended up together in this big supercontinent called Nuna. That was really the stabilization of what I would call big cratons and perhaps the inception of plate tectonics. That's a nice prototype to spoil the crust with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Questions? And for those of you who have questions, can you go by the microphone, please?
When you said mid-residue lateral spread, I think for the mantle plume heads, in the mind of many people, I think it's relatively easy. But when you start to melt with 5% metal extraction, all the volatiles are gone. The viscosity increase of 2 or 3 orders of magnitude from 10 to the 19 pascals per second to 22. It's almost impossible after melting. So what I'm saying is the spread before plume melting is easy, relatively. After melting start, when the residue is extremely difficult.
That's a good point. And in fact, we put the rheology in there. It's in that model. So the rheology is modeled on high melt extraction, but it's the flow, it's the plume flux flow that's pushing those residues apart.
Well, that would have to be largely before much melting begins, I guess.
Well, I mean, I guess I'd go to the modern Earth again as well and say, well, if you look underneath Hawaii, there's no Kraton there. You want to, and then the Ontong Java Plateau, yes, there's a little bit of plume residue that appears to be underneath there, but that's probably because it's trapped, it's jammed up against a subduction zone. So I think it's just very difficult dynamically to stack residues and keep them in that place, actually.
Okay.
No other question for Graham? I guess, okay. Before you ask your questions, can I make a point before half the room leaves? Please join us tonight at the VGP reception at 6:30 to help celebrate the VGP awardees, and hope to see you all there. Go ahead.
Hi, Graham. If the eclogites are happily subducted, what happens to the serpentinites that go down with them?
Well, so I think what we see as serpentinites on the ocean floor are rocks that have actually been serpentinized because they're placed at very high levels. So there's definitely serpentinites on the ocean floor. The question is, how much of that oceanic lithosphere is serpentinite? And to me, the answer is not very much, because the serpentinization is of peridotites that are placed in fracture zones. And the lower part of the oceanic lithosphere is actually rather unserpentinized. So yeah, they've got to go somewhere, and maybe they get stacked up in that accretionary wedge there. Or maybe Peter's a better person to tell us what happens to them, because he seems to be lingering.
Peter?
No, I'm not. But I was wondering if we could maybe draw a genetic link now between this work on the Cratonic mantle that you've really given a wonderful review talk on, and the work on, let's say, mid-mantle inclusion. So I'm wondering if the Oxborough and Parmentier idea has merit and is continuing till the present day, and if residues of buoyant, very highly depleted Hartsbergites might be the vehicle that brings mid-mantle inclusions into the, basically the source of kimberlites.
Yeah, I think that model has a great deal of merit, because I think they were really insightful in recognizing just how buoyant those residues are. And it must be that there's a lot of this stuff in the upper mantle that is almost waiting to be swept into areas where they can be slammed together and accreted. Yeah, so I think there's room for, I certainly would advocate that a lot of the signature we see, in some areas in particular, has to have a hydrous melting component. You could do it anhydrously at shallow pressures, but I think, and you can do it in plumes as well. But the key part, and I think what was really inspirational from me from seeing those models was just bringing home the fact that they will be hanging around, they will be in the uppermost part of the mantle, available for accretion to form a continental lithosphere.
Just to elaborate, and maybe we should just write the paper and not
Yeah.
talk about it here, but I'm just wondering if these depleted, very depleted residues, as they subduct and become hot enough to rise viscously, if they could be the spaceships that bring mid-mantle material, relatively dense eclogitic material, back.
I see what you're getting. Yeah, that's a good thought. I think we need a clever dynamicist to model that. That's beyond my talents, but that's a great point.
Thank you. Please join me again to congratulate Graham and Mary for the Bowen Award.